All right, Isaiah 13 begins a new section of Isaiah. You can see that in your outline, the second major section. Still, and you're thinking about, I don't have it up there on the chart, but the historical outline. Still within the Assyrian period, which is actually cause for some discussion starting tonight in regard to some criticism that comes from more liberal scholars, but we'll get to that in a moment. We're on the section that considers the judgment on foreign nations. Now, what you're going to see here is 10 nations that are considered spanning from chapter 13 through 23. The next three classes, 3 or 4, I can't remember the last division, I think maybe 3, including this class, but at any rate, we'll be covering this section of chapters 13 through 23. 10 nations, including one that's not foreign, including Judah, are going to be considered. You've got Babylon, and actually Babylon is mentioned twice in this section of Isaiah in the judgment of the nations. Philistia, we'll cover Babylon and Philistia tonight in chapters 13 and chapter 14. We'll get to Moab and Damascus, that is Syria and Ethiopia, on Sunday, Lord willing. And then there is Egypt and Edom. Edom is referred to as Duma. You can see in your outline what that might mean, but we know it's Edom because Mount Seir is mentioned, which is where the Edomites dwell. And then Arabia and Jerusalem, and then Tyre. Now, within this section on these 10 foreign nations, 9 foreign nations, and then also Judah as well, Jerusalem is considered. You're going to see Assyria mentioned twice, not a part of the 10 that are being judged, because remember, we considered Assyria already in our previous section, spanning from chapter 7 to chapter 10, and then chapter 11 and 12, Harry covered on the last class concerning the ultimate, crescendo of that first section, prophecies of Judah and Jerusalem looking forward to the time of the Messiah and his kingdom as the branch reigns. But we looked at Assyria already, and here in this section we'll see her mentioned again at the end of chapter 14, but it's in the same discussion of the judgment of Babylon, and we'll see that Assyria's prophecy of Assyria's destruction kind of stands as a promise not only of Babylon's fall, but the first being her rise. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. In chapter 17, Assyria is going to be mentioned again. But in chapter 17, in the section of Syria, or Damascus being judged, and Israel is also going to be mentioned in chapter 17. And we'll talk about that and why that's the case. We just studied chapter 7 through 10, where you had Syria and Israel coming together against Judah, and you had Judah making the mistake of turning to Assyria, and Assyria would be Judah's fall, but also Israel and Syria's fall. And so that's likely why Isaiah mentions Israel and Assyria there in chapter 17 when Assyria there in chapter 17 when Syria is judged. And so Isaiah has prophesied about the Assyrians being used. And what we saw there is kind of a blueprint for all we're going to study in this section with Assyria. God is using an evil nation. They're not good. They're not righteous. He's using an evil nation to judge his own people and other nations. And then he's going to judge them for their evil deeds as well. And we saw that God is in control. And eventually, through the use of Assyria, and we'll also see with Babylon, as well as we're familiar with, and other kingdoms that are not even mentioned in chapters 13 through 23, he will bring about the ultimate promise of the Messiah and the setting up of the eternal kingdom, as we saw foreshadowed in chapter 2, 4, and other places as well throughout our study. And so, consider the judgment of the nations in Isaiah 13 through 23 as being consistent with the other prophets. Not just having to do with Israel and Judah, as God's people as a whole, but God, where does he rule? Who is under his rule? Well, I guess maybe an easier question would be, who is not under his rule? No one. Everyone is under his rule. So while the Old Testament looks at God's concern with Israel, his own people, and it's a snapshot of their history, God is always working in the world, and he's ruling in the kingdoms of men. So our first question, what general principle is emphasized throughout this section of prophetic discourses against foreign nations, citing Daniel chapter 5:21? Anybody have that? Right. Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. Has that stopped? Hasn't, has it? God continues to sit on his throne, and all people are subject to him, at least in the sense of they are called to a responsibility of submitting to God, and if they don't, God's going to do something about it. And we're not just talking about the end judgment, but God is continuing to judge nations today in time, meaning we're not looking to the time after time stops, which is no time at all, and there's an eternal judgment. But he continues to rule in the kingdoms of men. Now, we don't necessarily have these prophetic discourses talking about America or Russia or China or whoever you think of, but be sure that he's ruling in the kingdoms of men. And what is the standard of his rule? His word, right? Old Testament obviously addressed to the Israelites, and the New Testament is going to judge the entire world. All are subject to it. And it's not that the New Testament was written to any nation. It's written to a spiritual nation, a spiritual people. But all of these concepts are still bound upon the entire world. And so righteousness exalts a nation, and sin is a reproach to any people, even to today. And so let's not forget that. He's judge of all the earth. That's what Abraham called him in Genesis 18 when he was going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, and he interceded for them. He calls him judge of all the earth. In chapter 66 of Isaiah, in verse 1, he'll say that the earth is his footstool. So he's judging then all people, and even still is today. And one of the big things that we can take from our previous study of God's use of Assyria is these people all over the world, not just the Israelites, not just Judah, they need to know that God is the only true God. Remember what Assyria said in chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. As I have done to the idols of Samaria, I'll do to the idols of Jerusalem, of Judah. And while obviously they were guilty of idolatry, his idea was that their God is inferior to my God. When a nation conquered another nation in times of antiquity, that's the conclusion they left with, is that our God is greater than these other people's God. Is God going to let that fly? No, he never will. God always asserts his dominance and makes sure people are left without excuse, and they will know that he rules. So he works in the kingdoms of men, and all of this has an ultimate goal. What's that ultimate goal? To do what? To bring about what? As Harry taught Sunday. Bring about what kingdom? The spiritual kingdom. So there's going to be a remnant that returns, but even a remnant of that remnant will be set up as the spiritual kingdom. Now here's some criticism. What time is Isaiah prophesying historically? Think back to that historical outline. There's 2 times in Isaiah. The first section deals with what? The Assyrian period, right? Well, Isaiah lived to see Babylonian captivity. Who's going to prophesy later about that? Several, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel's during that time we see, and then on into the Medo-Persian Empire. Here's the point. When we get to chapter 13, and then later on Babylon is mentioned again, this is well before Babylon is ever even a consideration on the world stage. In 605 BC, they would rise to power. One date we see mentioned here in our section in chapter 14 and verse 28 is the year that King Ahaz died. That's going to happen in 715 BC. We know when Isaiah's prophesying, but that just gives us a framework for this prophecy. In 605, Babylon comes to power. What does that tell us? Isaiah is a true prophet. But here's what happens. Liberal critics will say that must mean Isaiah could not have written these prophecies. But we'll deal with in the second half of Isaiah in the Babylonian period, when he's prophesying about those things, dealing with idols, challenging them to tell of the future, to perfectly tell of the past and the present and the future, to show that you are God. I read a quote by someone that said, it all depends on whether you spell God with a capital G or not. And of course we do. And so it's pretty easy for us to reason how Isaiah could prophesy about Babylon when it was never even thought of at this time. No one would have ever even imagined Babylon to rise to a world dominant stage. But they did, and Isaiah knew it by the Spirit of God well before it ever even happened. The Medes even were, kind of unknown during this time in a large scale, but they would be prophesied as well to be Babylon's downfall. So this prophecy doesn't come by the will of man, but Isaiah is being moved by the Holy Spirit. Any comments or questions up to this point? All right. Getting into the text. In chapter 13 and verse 1, we see a word, burden. A burden against Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. You're going to see this word used in each of the 10 sections dealing with the nations, except for in chapter 18, when he deals with Ethiopia, he says, woe to the land shadowed with buzzing wings that is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. And so this word is masa in the Hebrew, and it means an oracle, a heavy or weighty pronouncement of doom from Jehovah. This is something they're going to have to bear. So that's a word that's going to be used throughout this that you'll get used to seeing. And this is how it begins. Lift up a banner on the high mountain. That's one of three things that is described as Jehovah calling a people to take Babylon. Raise your voice to them is the second. So a banner's lifted up, a rallying point that can be seen on a high mountain, raised voice to them, waving of the hand that they may enter the gates of the nobles. That is another translation of princes, this idea of the magnificent city of Babylon. God's calling a people into the gates. They're not being invited by Babylon. God is inviting them to destroy Babylon. He calls them his sanctified ones. Our second question is, who are the sanctified ones that God has commanded to punish Babylon? We learn of that later on in this same chapter. Medo-Persians, right? In chapter 13 and verse 17, behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. Are they holy? He calls them sanctified ones. Are they holy? Are they pure? Are they righteous?
He has set them apart for that task.
Right. He has set them apart for that task. That's all that means. God is choosing them. And you'll see language throughout this that reflects what we studied with God using Assyria. He is choosing them. They're his sanctified ones. The Lord's anger is what is going to be poured out on Babylon by the Medes, by his sanctified ones, but this is all his doing, his mighty ones, he calls them. Those who rejoice in my exaltation. I think that the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Bible more accurately render that, according to the context, even my proudly exulting ones. They're always arrogant people that God is using, who are in power and won't give him the credit. Hence, God is going to destroy them as well. In verses 4 and 5, you get a description of these people. Now, he'll name them in verse 17, which is impressive, because this is over 100 years before that this will happen, 100 years before that they will rise to power, and then even more than that, before they will fall. He says, a noise of a multitude in the mountains, like that of many people, so things are picking up. This is impressive and dominant language of a people, a scary language, a tumultuous noise of the kingdom of nations gathered together. So this is a mixed people he's talking about, hence the Medo-Persian Empire. This is not a homogeneous group of people, but the opposite. And the Lord is mustering them. He says in verse 5, they come from a far country, from the end of heaven. Again, this language of the Lord is using them. They're his weapons to destroy the whole land. Remember in chapter 10 and verse 5, Assyria is called the staff of the Lord. In chapter 10 and verse 15, the axe, the saw, the rod, the staff, and the same thing is being used for the Medes and the destruction of Babylon. They're from a far off land, about 350 miles away is Persia. Comments, questions there? now he talks about the day of the Lord. What is the day of the Lord referring to? That's our third question. We saw that before in our study. It's been a few chapters.
Any day of judgment.
Any day of judgment. You're going to see several days that are talked about within Isaiah and the prophets, period. There's going to be the idea of that day, which is any day in its context. The context has to determine the last days, which is this last dispensation when the Messianic kingdom is set up. And then the day of the Lord is always a judgment of a nation in time, a destructive time of the Lord bringing down his wrath on a people. It looks to the ultimate day of the Lord. Obviously, all of them do. There will be an ultimate judgment, but it's not talking about the end of the time. It's talking about this judgment on Babylon. It comes as destruction from the Almighty. Play on words here. Showed from the Shadi. Powerful and violent destruction from the powerful and Almighty One. And so it's all coming from him. And that's what these judgments cause men to do, or at least are designed to cause men to do, is to look at God. He's in control. He is the one who has the power. And he speaks about how they're going to be completely helpless and despondent. And they're going to have pains like childbirth. And they're going to be astonished at the look of each other. They'll be amazed at each other when their faces are red like a flame of fire. And here in verse 9 and 10, it furthers the description of the judgment itself. He speaks about how it will come, that is the day of the Lord, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, laying the land desolate, destroying its sinners from it. I want us to pick up on that. When, especially you deal with critics, those who are probably not well versed in arguments, but they talk about how the God of the Old Testament was, hypocritical, talking about love and all this kind of stuff, and destroying all of these nations, bringing his people in and destroying all these people. But what was always the reason for the destruction of any people that God caused? Sin. All the time. And what we'll see throughout this judgment on Babylon, the severity is highlighted, and even the fruit of the womb is not going to be spared. Now, here comes a cruelty of a people who are not trying to follow God. God is using them, but he's also never necessarily condoning their actions, even in conquest, as he's using them. He will judge them for even how they are being used to judge his people and other people, like Babylon. And so their cruelty, how they are not merciful at all, God's going to judge them for that kind of hatred and that kind of intensity of conquest. They're going to be judged, period. But when it comes down to it, God is always just in his dealings with men. And when a people are destroyed, they're destroyed for sin that they have committed. And innocent people get destroyed with those who are not innocent from time to time. And the Lord has the prerogative to make that call, especially as he's using nations who are evil in and of themselves. So you have sin as the problem. Now in verse 10, there's something interesting. He says, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. That's our thought question. So let's go ahead and get to that and deal with that now. Is the description of that verse literal? Yes or no? It's not literal. And so what's the meaning of it? What does that describe for us? There's similarity between that and his discussion of the day star in the next chapter. You can cut down. Yes.
To me, it's like when you say it was a dark day, bad things are going to happen. It's dreary, it's just a terrible day. It's a description of a terrible, terrible day.
Yeah.
The sun may be shining and everything, but you don't care. It's a terrible day.
That's a great point. That utter destruction, what would bring utter destruction to mind more than the stars falling, right? And the sun not giving its light. That's certainly the case. Throughout the prophets, especially as I mentioned in chapter 14, you have an individual talked about as the day star. You have these leaders that are seen as bright shining lights, and they're, the king of Babylon speaking arrogantly about himself as well, and you have them brought down, cast down. It's just utter destruction and decimation that is talked about and using in reference here to a nation. A nation is going to be brought down. So think about that in reference to a passage like Matthew 24 and verse 29 that kind of uses that same language. How does a text like Isaiah 13 verse 10 help us understand it when we see Jesus say in Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Without even reading any other verse in Matthew 24, knowing Isaiah 13:10, what could you start to reason is being talked about in Matthew 24? What kind of a judgment? Of a nation, of a people, in time. But what does the premillennialist do with Matthew 24? Makes all that literal in regard to this prophetic language of destruction, like the sun not giving its light, and the moon not shining, so on and so forth, the heavens and the earth being shaken, and talk about it being the end of time. But in Isaiah 13, it's talking about the judgment of a nation. In Matthew 24, it's talking about the judgment of God's people and the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. So we got to kind of keep our thoughts lined up and consistent with the whole of Scripture when we're talking about these things. You have something here?
That's definitely the point. There may be a second point in that. Babylon was always known for using the constellation, the stars, in the astrology. And they're talked about that way, especially all through the prophets. Isaiah will later on denote that. And when he uses the term that the stars of the heaven and the constellation will not give their light, the word light is really not the usual word you have for brightness or shining. It has to do some illumination that's more of thought, is typically what that is. I think he might be using a kind of a dual point and saying what they're turning to for their light instead of God is not going to give them light. It's not going to help them at all. And what you're talking about definitely is the point as well, that overall it's showing the judgment against Babylon that will come there.
Okay. So in verse 11, he picks up more on the judgment, just adding to the severity. He speaks about their haughtiness being made low, so they're arrogant. Again, verse 11 highlights the reason is their iniquity when it comes down to it. Mortals are more rare than fine gold. He speaks in verse 13 about similar language to what we would talk about. We see in Matthew 24 about the earth and the heavens being shaken, the wrath of the Lord and the day of his fierce anger. This is a judgment on a nation that is being talked about. It's not speaking about the whole world literally being shaken. In verse 14, they're going to be scattered like wild animals, but also domesticated animals. Sheep scatter, and the shepherd can't go gather them back. Everyone's fleeing to his own. Everyone will be thrust through. Everyone will fall by the sword. Verse 16, here's how bad it is. Even the children will be dashed to pieces. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravaged. He'll talk about even children being destroyed as well as we go forward. He identifies his sanctified ones again that he's calling in verse 17 as the Medes, and they're not going to regard silver or gold. What does that mean? Can be bought off. Someone comes up to mug you on the street, they, by the very nature of the thing they're doing, can be bought off most times. Give them your wallet, hopefully they'll leave you alone. Not these people. All they do is, with their hatred, come against the Babylonians to utterly destroy them. And in verse 18, it speaks about young men and the fruit of the womb and children. So three descriptions of youth in various stages, all of them. They're not going to be spared. They're going to be decimated. They'll go from glory, being the glory of kingdoms, again, remember, Isaiah's prophesying well before anyone would even think about Babylon on this kind of a stage. Spoken of universally as a glorious kingdom to be envied, and they will be decimated, brought low. They'll be like Sodom and Gomorrah, to the point of not being inhabited or settled by anyone. Wild beasts are there in verses 21 and 23. That's who's settling in Babylon. Is that true today?
Yes.
Yes. Before I was old enough to care, you might remember Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild. Did he succeed ultimately? No. So even today, the locals think of the place as being under a curse. They don't want anything to do with it. That impresses me with the power of God's word in this prophecy. Comments, questions about that?
If you look at the picture of why would no one pitch a tent there or his sheep feed on that area, because it's a desert. And you see two pictures of Babylon that are seen. In one sense, it's like a swamp, and in the other, it's mounds of dirt. And literally, that's what happens as the Medo-Persians come in and change the river so that they can go in under that to the city. It shifts, and over time, there's a small part of Babylon that has become a swamp, and the very much larger part of it, you have just like huge mounds of dirt, just a big desert. And obviously, no shepherd would feed his sheep there because there's nothing to eat.
Yeah, uninhabitable. You see the power of God's providence. This wasn't miraculous. He brought in a people and used those people who were doing their thing to bring this destruction, and it stands even to today that it's not inhabited. All right, point out a mistake I made on question 4. That should be verses 1 through 2, verses 3 through 23, and verses 24 through 27. Looking at other things, put in the wrong verses. But there are 3 things, might not be readily apparent to you, I understand, that we'll see in chapter 14. You have in verses 1 through 2, Israel restored to their own land as a result of Babylon's fall. And then you have Israel singing the taunt song after Babylon's fall. And then God's purpose being accomplished, which is why he brings up Assyria beginning in verse 24. As I have thought, so it shall come to pass. As I have purposed, it shall stand. So we're still talking about Babylon, but for a moment, he looks to the future of Babylon's fall resulting in the remnant returning. Remember in chapter 1 and verse 9, the remnant mentioned. In chapter 6 and verse 13, a remnant mentioned. In chapter 7 and verse 3, Shear Jashub, which is Isaiah's son, which means a remnant shall return, is mentioned. And then in chapter 10 and verses 20 through 23, speaking of Assyria's destruction and the sparing of Judah, a remnant will be left. Always looking to a physical remnant returning, and then what else? As Harry pointed out in chapter 11. A second remnant. He's going to reach out a second time and bring his people from places that wouldn't make sense if we're just talking about this physical remnant returning from captivity. And so you kind of see it both here in chapter 14 and verses 1 and 2. He speaks about the Lord having mercy on his people, bringing them to settle in their own land. Who's going to be joined with them during this time? Is it just going to be Jews? Other nations, so strangers will settle with them. In Esther 8 and verse 17, many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. In Acts 2, when you see on the day of Pentecost, there were both Jews and proselytes within the city. And so they come and have strangers with them. Now here's something interesting in verse 2. As they're brought back, we'll talk about Cyrus being the one who effected that by the Lord through him. The house of Israel will possess for themselves, verse 2, servants and maids in the land of the Lord. They will take them captive, whose captives they were, and rule over their oppressors. So it's going to be reversed. But did that ever literally happen? In regard to them being dominant over the Gentiles within their own land, and they're their servants to to that degree? How would that happen in this messianic time? How would that come about? Through what? How are men subdued by the Lord's soldiers? By His Word. Taking captive the thoughts to the obedience of Christ. We see in 2 Corinthians 10. And so we're sent out as soldiers with the sword of the Lord to make captive people for Him. And so it's not a complete reversal in regard to they're now the despots over these people, but you've got the spiritual fulfillment in the Messianic kingdom. You have some here to add to that. All right. Going on in verse 3, still with regard to this, after Babylon falling, they will do what? When they rest from their sorrow, what will they do? In verse 4, more specifically. They would take up a what? A proverb against Babylon. It's a Hebrew word, masal, and it means a song of jest or mocking. Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament says. And who are they going to be mocking, taunting? This is important. The king of Babylon. Keep that in mind. The king of Babylon, in verse 16, he'll consider the man. Is this the man who made the earth tremble? And later on, he'll speak about kings, and then, but you, in contrast to these kings, won't be buried in your grave you built for yourself, your tomb you've hewn out. So we're talking about a man. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or any one king, I don't think, but just all of them summed up together in this one personification of the kings of Babylon. Keep that in mind when we get to verse 12. It'll be important. The oppressor is oppressed. The Lord broke his staff and his scepter. So verse 5 and 6 are parallel. With his staff, he struck the people, and that staff is broken. With his scepter, he ruled the nations in anger. That is broken as well. And he is persecuted, and no one hinders. The whole earth is at rest and quiet now after he falls. And they break forth into singing. The cypress trees rejoice over you, the cedars of Lebanon, and say, since you were cut down, no woodsman has come up against us. Whether it's talking about the actual created trees that are metaphorically personified in this way, singing against him and rejoicing, or as we've seen throughout Isaiah, trees representing men of power cut down, like in Isaiah 10 about the Assyrians, the rest of the trees of his forest will be so few in number that a child may write them. Here you've got the whole world seeing his humiliation and rejoicing in it. This king, these people in Babylon were terrible, and the world trembled beneath them, but not anymore. Hell is going to be excited because of you. I'm so sorry about falling behind on this. I'm really good at it. There you go, the tyrant king of Babylon, beginning in verse 3. And so even hell's going to meet him. That's the word Sheol, as we're familiar with. The grave, the place of departed spirits. It's personified as stirring up all the other kings, chief ones of the earth, who had fallen because, their judgment came. And now this one who no one would have thought this great kingdom would fall, and it did, just like the Assyrian kingdom fell, and all the other kingdoms will fall because God rules. They shall speak and say, have you become as weak as we? Have you become like us? Verse 10. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your stringed instruments. The maggot is spread under you, and worms cover you. So where before he made his bed of luxury in his palace, now he's sleeping on worms and maggots cover him. So what a dramatic change. Death is going to take us all, and we need to take note of that and think about that as individuals here, even in this place. Think about the pride of the kings of Babylon that we're familiar with, and they saw their reckoning. And it's going to be for us as well. Just like Babylon is being judged because of their iniquity, their sin, same with us. We're going to be judged. We'll talk about that in later studies as why we see Israel and even Judah and Jerusalem mentioned in all of these lists of ungodly kingdoms. If we start acting like the world, we're going to get the same fate. Here.
Chronicles of Medo-Persians point out very clearly that they not temple and so forth, and God's anger was kindled. Well, the Chronicles made it very clear there was left no one of a kingly or noble rule. The reason they did that is because they didn't want the kingdom to come back up. And so they slaughtered everybody that was there that had anything to do with nobility at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can always I'll remember that from Daniel chapter 5 and what happened there with the writing on the wall and the Medes and the Persians coming in that night. Notice verse 12. He says, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you were cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. Here is question 6. Who is Lucifer? And what does this language about him indicate? Who's Lucifer? King of Babylon. Now, there's a TV show, I think, that's titled Lucifer. And who are they talking about? And when you hear that used? The devil. I believe the church fathers, some of them wrote about this, referring to Satan in other writings as well. Where's the devil in this? He's not in there, is he? Now, there's a New Testament passage that is paralleled with this oftentimes in discussing the devil in Luke 10 and in verse 18. That passage, Jesus himself says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And you've got Lucifer, son of the morning, is cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. And Jesus was referring to this. They're talking about the devil. There is nothing in either context which would lead us to make a necessary conclusion that the Spirit is talking about Satan at all. In Luke 10, the 70 are sent out in the first 12 verses. They're going to be able to heal sickness, and evidently, after the woe to these cities who won't receive the gospel, as they say, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name, they're able to cast out demons. And then that's when Jesus said, I saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. And then he says, behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. The spirits, he says, are subject to them, but you should rejoice that your names are written in heaven. His point is that by my authority, you can subdue even the servants of Satan. What does that mean about Satan? Is his power unlimited or limited? Is he going to be subdued or not? Jesus is in control. And he's here to bind up the strong man, like Matthew chapter 12 indicates. So this idea of Satan falling from heaven like lightning is not an origin story. We don't know. We're not given, the scripture doesn't disclose the origin story of Satan. It's talking about Satan being subdued during this time of the Messiah's reign.
Plus, what does lightning do when it comes out from heaven? Have you ever seen it make anything better? No, it's destructive. That's the nature of Satan. And that's the point being brought here. Is his destructive power is all that he's got. And even that is limited. And if you go on, what is translated in the King James as hell is pretty clearly all throughout Sheol, or the place of the dead. It's that the king of Babylon is not going to live and continue to have power. He's going to be killed, and he's going to be made absolutely powerless.
Right. And, verse 15 mentions Sheol is the same word in chapter 9, or 14, verse 9, translated hell. He's going to be brought down to the grave. That is Lucifer. And then others will look at him, and they'll gaze at him. The second light hasn't flickered, has it? I know the first one has. Okay. And they're going to taunt him as well. Kings of the nations, they get to sleep in glory. They hewn out for themselves their own tombs. And you've got the king of Babylon too, but he's cast out like an abominable branch, verse 19, like a garment. Those who are slain, he's thrust through the sword. You are not going to be able to be joined with them in glorious burial. And it's because you brought it on yourself. By your conquest, you have destroyed your own land and slain your own people. The brood of evildoers will never be named. That comes back to this point, I believe, that Harry was making before. They didn't want anyone to be left to where this nation can rise up again. The slaughter will be for his children because of the iniquity of their fathers, lest they rise up and possess the land, verse 21, and fill the face of the world with cities. Verses 22 and 23 reminds us of what we read at the end of chapter 13. after he says the remnant's going to be cut off of Babylon and all his offspring and posterity, the wild animals will dwell there. Marshes of muddy water, like Harry was talking about before. Now you get to verse 24, and he mentions that his word is going to be successful as he's thought it will come to pass. Then he mentions the Assyrian in verse 25. He mentions the Assyrian because the Assyria's fall would be necessary by the word of God, as it's prophesied, for Babylon to ever rise to power. And Assyria was judged as well. They're no longer a nation that is ruling. But what will that mean for Babylon, too? Just like God prophesied Assyria would fall, and they fell, Babylon, you're going to rise, but you're going to fall as well. You can be assured that they will be a world-dominant power. You can also be assured that they will fall. The last section there, he speaks of Philistia. Don't rejoice in the fall of your enemy, because others are coming with you. But God will preserve, as he's founded Zion, the core of his people will have refuge with him in verse 32. Flew through the last part.
All of these are ones where the people of God have been afflicted greatly by Babylon, Assyria, and Philistia. But all of them were overcome.
Yeah, and what you're going to see is Moab's hope would be to go where refuge is in Jerusalem as well, Mount Zion. And they refused that hope. All right, we'll be on chapter 15, Lord willing, on Sunday.